Video call? I mean, generally I'm really good at guessing, but like even though sometimes it gets me.
I'm pretty like Chinese. I'm Chinese.
Yeah.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Institute of International Studies. My name is Daniel Sargent, and I'm co-director of the Institute. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here for what promises to be an immensely interesting and timely discussion on the future of the international security order. Today's session is part of a four-part series on the fate of international order that we put together at the beginning of the semester. We called the series Rupture in acknowledgement of Prime Minister Carney's address to the, wasn't Munich, it was Davos conference in January. Little did we know when we conceived the conference just how timely the series, and in particular this panel on the fate of the security order, would really become. We actually prepared our questions of the panelists before this weekend's events. I'm sure that many of you will have questions of your own related to the highly dynamic situation in the Middle East. And I'm sure that the presenters will be willing to venture beyond their arenas of immediate comfort to talk about the Middle East. All I'm going to do is just introduce our panelists and our moderator, and then I'm going to retreat. As you can all see, I'm a little preoccupied more than I would ordinarily be today by family responsibilities. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I'll start with Andrew REDDIE, who is seated closest to where I'm standing. Andrew is a professor here at UC Berkeley. He teaches in Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy, where he is also executive director and founder of the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. Andrew is a political scientist of extraordinary intellectual dexterity and range. His interests include the intersection of technology and the international political and security orders, cybersecurity, nuclear weapons, wargaming, and a variety of emerging leading-edge military technologies are among his research interests. Next, MICHAELA is a professor of political science here at Berkeley and a prominent specialist in international relations. Her research and teaching interests situate at the intersection of international conflict and cooperation. The intersection of conflict and cooperation really is a key dynamic to which MICHAELA may well speak today. Her research has addressed the ways in which adversaries can manage and resolve disagreements without necessarily making recourse to large-scale bombing campaigns. She's especially interested, another timely topic, in the effects of domestic politics on countries' foreign policy behavior and how domestic politics in particular affect the willingness of countries to engage in structured international cooperation. Finally, I'm delighted to welcome to Berkeley Jake HECLA, who is joining us from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he is a Stanton postdoctoral fellow in the Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy. He's a specialist in emerging technology and its relationship to international security, and has particular interests in nuclear thermal propulsion, microreactors, and advanced radiation detection techniques. So if you have questions about Iran's nuclear program and its likely capabilities after this week of bombing, Jake is the man to ask. In addition to being a postdoctoral fellow at MIT, I should mention Jake is a proud graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, from which he holds not only he holds a PhD and a Master's of Science. His undergraduate degree was from MIT. So it's wonderful, Jake, to have you back to Berkeley. Finally, before I get out of the way, let me just very briefly introduce Bennett Freeman, who is a senior fellow at IIS, who's really Bennett, along with Jess, who co-conceived this wonderful series, which I'm introducing. Bennett, in addition to his work at IIS, is a man of extraordinary range and accomplishment. He's been Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor. Subsequent to his time at the State Department, he led the sort of ethical investment operation at Calvert. He's worked across sectors, government, the private sector, and the nonprofit world. He's been at the forefront of a variety of prominent and consequential humanitarian and human rights initiatives, including the highly successful campaign to eradicate cotton slavery in Kazakhstan. And the success of that campaign, I think, is worth noting in any introduction, especially if you can get the country right. So with that, let me turn it over to Bennett and welcome you all to the Institute. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, I think we have a seat here and a couple of people could sit here, so no one has to stand for an hour and a half. You can also move the pizza boxes out of the way if you want to sit back there. We're happy to have a full house, but sorry, there aren't quite enough chairs.
So, well, this is great. I'll just stand up, just sit down when I turn first to MICHAELA. But thanks to Professor Sargent, I'm a good friend and colleague for the last decade. And Daniel, you really took the phrase right out of my head, thinking half an hour ago coming across the bay on BART. Little did we expect, little did we know when we conceived this series in January, how extraordinarily timely it would be. You know, there was merely a few hiccups in U.S. foreign policy and the international community in the first year of the Trump administration, but then in January and February, and what we woke up to last Saturday morning has been truly historic in its disruption and further implications, which we'll talk about now. So we're going to start with NATO, and before I ask the first question of MICHAELA, I just want to say that NATO has its own theology, its own catechism, its own language. And I remember in June of 1993, when I was chief speechwriter for Secretary of State Warren Christopher, being assigned to do my first NATO foreign ministerial speech for him. I was told that I was going to do the intervention, and I was a little puzzled by that word, thinking that I was a speechwriter and not a military commander doing an intervention. And I was told, no, that's just NATO lingo for the speeches by the foreign ministers of the North Atlantic Council. So with that, if you could do a quick would be a couple hours, but no, really quick, sort of NATO one-on-one, 101, you know, given how central NATO has been to transatlantic security, global collective security, post-war international order going back 8 decades, and its credibility being questioned severely in recent months. If you could just do a quick overview of what NATO is, what its fundamental purpose and commitments are, and why its credibility matters so much.
Yeah, but this is working. It's not just that.
Oh, you just have to touch the power button, I think.
Sorry, okay, that's good. So first of all, my apologies, I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is suffering, which is why everyone who has a microphone here. But yeah, so on NATO, there's obviously a lot one can say, as Bennett said. So just very sort of broad overview. It was founded in 1949 after World War II. It had initially 12 members. There are 32 members. So it has over time expanded eastwards, mostly. Of course, the most recent members joined last year, and the previous year are Finland and Sweden. So essentially, NATO is a defense alliance. So its primary clause or Article 5, which says that an urgent attack against one or more states is an attack on everyone in NATO. And therefore, each member will take such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. Note there's a little bit of an escape clause here about action it deems necessary, right? So it does not require immediate force, but it sort of asks the members to use whatever they think is an appropriate action in response to that attack. So importantly, like another way of thinking about NATO is what the famous statement by the first NATO Secretary General, which is that NATO is about keeping Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Right, where it is primarily directed as a Cold War means against the Soviet Union and to try to deter the Soviet Union from any aggression towards Europe that would provide use. the idea is to keep the US in there, right? So it would be drawn in through NATO, right? That's the keeping the Americans in part. And of course, the Germans down part is that, after World War II, nobody wants Germany, particularly militarily dominant, and wants people to see it contained. So it is a defense alliance, and defense alliances typically have two interrelated purposes. One is capability aggregation, right? The logic is that if you fight together with others and you share the burden, you're going to fight at lower cost and greater effectiveness than if you fight on your own. And the idea is that makes you a more formidable adversary, which should deter the potential aggressor, right? So that's the secondary goal. Our primary goal is deterrence, but it's ensured through this capability aggregation. So NATO's also, there are many alliances. Many of them are sort of much more on paper. NATO is like a real organization, with a real staff, and sort of a much more institutionalized than your typical alliances, sort of what was already said. So NATO's raison d'être, right? Like the reason for its existence kind of diminished after the end of the Cold War because it was directed towards the Soviet Union, was effective in, of course, containing that threat. It was never any real challenge against Europeans, any NATO members. But once the Soviet Union disappears, like what is the purpose of NATO? And so NATO had to reinvent itself a bit here. And so we see sort of both an expansion towards including more Eastern European countries, but also then engaging in humanitarian interventions in Bosnia and Herzegovina and possible involvement in Libya too. The only time NATO actually has ever been invoked for its original purpose of defending a member attack after 9/11 in support of the United States, right? So that is the only time NATO's Article 5 has ever been really involved. And so what, so NATO sort of struggled with the reason for existence for a while, and then, had some purpose in sort of anti-terrorism action in Afghanistan, and also like expanded into cyber sort of operations. And then really, I would say, was reinvigorated with the attack of Russia on Ukraine, which very much is, seen as a threat by especially the eastern flank of NATO against their sovereignty and independence. And so that has really, in a way, strengthened NATO in recent years. But then, in other ways, NATO has been significantly weakened as a result of the US government's actions for the sometimes.
So on that, let's pick up on US government actions in recent times, which is a artfully diplomatic euphemism for certain individuals and actors. But in Trump 1, there was a tough, even ferocious push for NATO members to increase defense spending up to 5% of GDP, and that's been repeated, reinforced over the last year with most following in line, part of Spain. You've had, though, a lot of questions in the last year as to what role the US, let alone European allies, would play, or NATO as a whole, with any potential peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine. But you also had dramatically, beginning last year, in the first weeks of this administration, and then even more dramatically in the month of January, open threats made to the sovereignty of the NATO ally, by one, namely the US, to another, namely Denmark, in relation to Greenland. And those rhetorical threats were so compelling as to cause really a crisis in transatlantic relations. Trump's speech at Davos, throwing back the gauntlet. Prime Minister Carney, incredible to think that Canada is now doing defense contingency planning for a potential attack in the US. It's kind of mind-blowing. So my question to you, and I think get Andrew and Jake into this as well, is NATO's credibility truly at stake here? How much does that matter? How does that play out in potential Russia-Ukraine settlement? And how realistic is a somewhat separate European defense capability within or outside NATO? Now, those are a lot of questions, but there's something for everybody on the panel, just I think in those few lines right there. So, MICHAELA, back to you, and then let's go to Andrew and Jake on this.
First I would say, so the US has covered the largest share of the defense burden of NATO historically, right? 64% of the defense burden was US in 2024. the initial, I mean, in his first term in office, President Trump pushed the members to go to 3%. Many of them were below that. He was not the first US president who did that, right? Others have also pushed for that. He did it maybe more aggressively than others. Most members are now actually at the 3%, and now the demand has been made for 5%, which they're not necessarily at there. I think I would also say that there actually is a whole array of things that have challenged NATO. So the Greenland crisis in January was, I think, the most prominent one. But there's so many other things. I mean, President Trump's support or embrace of Russia over Ukraine, right? That challenges NATO. You had the signal chat, right, with the commentary on the people there about basically calling Europeans pathetic. You had Vice President J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, not this year, but last year, attacking Europeans for their weakness. You had President Trump's recent comments about sort of dismissing the sacrifices of European soldiers, NATO soldiers in Afghanistan. You have claims to the US, Canada as the 51st states. So you have signs that US is stepping back from NATO, just surrendered 2 of the command positions actually to Europeans for the first time. And so you have and you obviously, then there's the whole economic aspect of the tariffs on these close allies, right? So you have a whole range of actions. And I think it's very clear that it has already weakened NATO. I mean, we have seen Russia engage in Europe in ways that it would not have dared to when NATO was still effective. I mean, we saw last year the drones over Poland, right, which they claimed was an accident. We saw the fighter jets over Estonian territory. So those are things that, and I mean, Russian fighter jets, Russian drones, like that is stuff that should have been deterred by effective NATO lines, but that is not being deterred anymore. We're seeing an increase of sabotage and other actions within Europe, all by Russia. So I think all of these are reflective that NATO has been already weakened as a result of all of these actions. So maybe I'll hand over to others.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate the point on the gray zone because effectively Russia's in Europe, the US is out, and Germany's on its way up. So you can kind of turn what you heard from the First Secretary General entirely on his head. I think Jake might be the only one of the 3 of us actually been in Ukraine, so I'll leave much of that to him. But all to say that neither the Russians or the US are particularly interested in NATO being involved in any sort of a peacekeeping arrangement, etc. In the event that they get to some sort of negotiated settlement, it is likely that somebody will be policing it, but obviously the Russians want it to be their proxies, and the Americans just don't want it to be our boots on the ground. Our boots on the ground are going elsewhere, as we can talk about later, if you would like. One of the things that is worth noting is that there are long-held tensions. MICHAELA got to quite a few of them, particularly around burden sharing. The other one is about the status of nuclear weapons inside of NATO. The nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrent inside of NATO is primarily an American and British endeavor. Indeed, the French leave the room whenever nuclear weapons come up. So it's not as if there weren't already challenges inside of getting these countries to actually cooperate with one another fully. And so these tensions are kind of been lurking, and now of course are to the fore with Greenland. I think one of the things that I'm tracking quite closely is the degree to which the Europeans might seek to indigenize their supply chain for military material. Traditionally, they've bought a lot of American, as you can imagine. One of the things that NATO has done well, in addition to all the things that MICHAELA mentioned, is creating an interoperable fighting force. I don't think that the Trump administration thought hard about the downstream consequences for the likes of Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, etc., when they were being so antagonistic towards NATO allies and partners in the region. I will also say, broadening this out a bit, our other allies and partners in East Asia are watching US engagements with NATO very, very closely. So this ends up coloring our relationship with the South Koreans and the Japanese as well. And so it's a very complex security picture. I should have also said, thank you, Daniel, for doing this. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Bennett, for having us. The fact that all of you are here, I think, is a good thing because we're delighted, but it's also a bad thing because it suggests this conversation is necessary. And so, things are definitely kind of up in the air, as Ben has pointed out.
Before we go to Jake, I just want to ask one or more of you to amplify this point about the defense companies, where the American defense contractors, and you rattled off a few of the names, Andrew, have played the largest leading roles for decades. Lockheed Martin and Boeing, Northrop Grumman, all the others. But there are major European defense contractors, the BAE in Britain, there's Dassault in France, it's been in the news in recent days, plenty of others. But there is also a view, really a reality, that the European defense industrial base is so relatively small and weak compared to the US, and that however much pressure Trump puts on the Europeans and however willing the Europeans are to develop their own, expand and accelerate their own defense capability, it's going to take not months but years to have a credible European defense establishment that doesn't rely mostly on US bang bang, right? So how are the Europeans dealing with that? You mentioned that the Germans, and it was in the Financial Times this morning, a piece about the pace of German rearmament is now beginning to alarm some of the European allies. You have the Macron's offer to actually share some nuclear capability with other European allies. How do you see this playing out? How do you think Europeans get into the game here?
I mean, if they're smart, they'll indigenize and hedge wherever they possibly can. And the things that they absolutely have to buy. I mean, ultimately, the supply chain is a little bit more varied than perhaps we sometimes think. There's a lot of Israeli technology actually inside of Europe as well. And so they'll do what they can by themselves. Rheinmetall's market cap is increasing in the double digits percentages. In Germany, it is the case that you just can't like spin up all in one go. But I will also point out, it's not as if the US defense industrial base is awesome. We can't produce enough 125 millimeter shells to keep up with what's being expended in Ukraine at the present moment, let alone doing adventures in Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or wherever's next. And so there's massive challenges across the defense industrial base across the globe and amongst allies, and big questions about how even the US is going to procure naval vessels moving forward, right, for what the Navy wants to do. Conversations, and again, this is why it's important. South Korea is actually probably the place that the US would look for massive, right, scaling of naval capability, while the South Koreans are also doing all sorts of hedging in the same way that the Europeans are. So all is not rosy, regardless of which industry you're looking at.
Exactly.
I
I'm just going to turn it to Jake, but yeah.
I just wanted to say, so what might be helpful to think about is what the US is especially strong at, what the Europeans are not, which is basically like surveillance and intelligence. That, like, I mean, in Ukraine, that is really where the Ukrainians are relying heavily on the US still. Also strategic lift, like being able to deploy your forces places, and anti like missile defense, and then space-based assets, right? So those are the things the US is much advantaged relative to the Europeans. And where it will be hard for the Europeans to catch up. I think current estimate says it will take 5 to 10 years for Europeans to, be able to be relatively, sustainable, like be able to like operate on their own. We are seeing though a lot of distrust towards the US, right? There's worries about US, airplanes having kill switches that then could be operated by Americans, and then like, why do you want to buy those planes if they can just suddenly be taken offline by Americans? And so we're seeing Canada announce, like, it's reviewing for the second time the purchase of their US fighter jets. It's like directing more money at home. Like we're seeing plans to, for Five Eyes kind of intelligence, but in the European context. So we're seeing a lot of redirection in that way. And one just final point is President Trump and others are pushing these countries to try to increase their defense budget, is hoping that that money flows to Americans. But that is not what is likely to be happening going forward, right? That money is going to go to those various European and Canadian companies.
Exactly. So it's perfect, MICHAELA, perfect segue to Jake. And Jake, a couple things. First, any comment you'd like to add on defense industrial base, transatlantic Europe in particular, but also to get Ukraine into the discussion here. And that's kind of a multi-pronged set of issues, everything from what role NATO and the US would play in a settlement, depending on the configuration of the settlement, the war with Russia. But I think the really interesting thing, given your expertise, which is highly technical, is to comment also on the extraordinary innovation, and I don't understand the technology, but I've been reading a little bit about the extraordinary innovation on the part of the Ukrainians. I mean, not just on the drones that we all read about, but there's a case to be made that the future or the immediate future of warfare of high-tech warfare is being forged by the Ukrainian military and civilian volunteers. I mean, tell us a little bit about that, the broader Ukraine picture since you've been there.
Absolutely. Let me first start with just a follow-up comment on European defense industrial
Good.
base. There are many different weapon systems that we can discuss, but just one I'd like to focus on. There is no European alternative for a fifth generation fighter at the moment. The United States had initial operating capability in the F-22 back in 2006, 2007. We now have around 700 F-35s deployed. The Europeans have purchased a number of these, Israelis have purchased a number of these, but there is no low observable fighter or low observable bomber capability by a European company at the moment. This is a technology that has many very long lead time items and has an exceptionally slow ability to ramp. Low observable coatings are some of the most classified technologies that the US has that are shared very sparingly at best. The Europeans will have a very long and very difficult road to be able to operationalize a fifth generation fighter capability. And the UK has an effort jointly, is it with France? The GCAP program? Yeah, which is not going well, to say the least. The investment necessary, the political commitment necessary, get a fifth generation fighter or bomber capability is something that will be quite challenging for the Europeans. Really?
Yeah, that was reported last week. It's not final, but that's the drift of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
To pivot now to Ukraine. To speak to a point that was made earlier, with the US's retreat from assistance in Ukraine, that is, our outlays to assist in Ukrainian defense have plummeted. In 2025, they're low. In 2026, they're effectively zero. And as of yesterday, the aid has actually started to flow the other direction, and the US is asking the Ukrainians for help in the interception of one-way attack UAVs because of all the research and development that's taking place there. The Ukrainians are very, very unlikely to be incentivized by any form of US security guarantees going forward, which I think significantly negatively impacts the ability to have a conclusion to this war anytime soon. The Ukrainians are, willing to purchase US arms, but our promises are simply not worth very much at this point. And this is reflected in the way that they are planning their defense outlays. And one of the things that we should take a look at is where the Ukrainians are putting their money based on what they have learned from this conflict and also learned from the 12-day war in Israel. So what have we learned in the last couple of years? We have seen that ballistic missile defense systems appear to work reasonably well when enough interceptors are available. This is a change from the status quo. Prior to this, the last time we had major BMD used it, ballistic missile defense, for those of you unfamiliar with that three-letter acronym. The last time we had that was in the Gulf War with absolutely miserable interception capability. In the early 90s, kind of the learning that we got from that was that ballistic missile defense was much harder than we thought it was. And many people, including folks at MIT, were quite skeptical up until 2 or 3 years ago, really, that BMD would be effective on the battlefield. We also seem to see something that's a bit contradictory. There doesn't seem to be a strong advantage from hypersonic systems, specifically hypersonic cruise glide vehicles that we've seen deployed by Russia and that we have seen deployed in very small numbers by the Iranians. They seem to get shot down by advanced ballistic missile defense systems with reasonably high probability. And theater ballistic missile systems, things like HIMARS, PRSM, Iskander, Tochka, have been exceptionally useful in both the conflict in Israel and in the conflict in Ukraine. Going forward, we're likely to see indigenous capabilities crop up in Europe, of course in Ukraine as well, of kind of the following technologies. At the theater or tactical level, we expect to see a lot more development of low observable cruise missiles. Low observable cruise missiles have been provided by the Europeans to the Ukrainians in small numbers, and they have been devastatingly effective. We're also likely to see new navigation systems emerging for denied environments. the Russians have actually been quite effective in jamming GPS systems across Europe. But specifically on the battlefield of Ukraine, which complicates any sort of drone operations that take place, especially any sort of drone operations that are intended to be semi-autonomous. We're also likely to see the mass production of low-cost drones, not necessarily because they are effective in actually putting tons of explosive on target, but because they're very useful for expending your enemy's stockpiles, point defenses, ballistic missile interceptors, of whatever sort of anti-drone munitions they have. And the offense-defense cost balance there is very, very favorable to the offense. And then finally, we're likely to see more development of theater ballistic missile systems. Things like Iskander have been very useful for Russia. Ukraine has developed Neptune, and I believe there's one more. What is it? Grom, which is similar to the Iskander system. And those have proven to be some of the most valuable tools in this fight. But in the longer term, the abandonment of allies that we've seen and the abandonment of Ukraine is going to incentivize nuclear hedging across Europe and probably across Asia as well. Japan is on the verge of opening the Rokasho reprocessing facility. The South Koreans are very interested in developing their own reprocessing capabilities. And if you look even at the academic literature, you can see that the emphasis is shifting strongly toward the development of indigenous reprocessing or enrichment capacity. And you can see this as both a desire to achieve some form of energy security and also as a way of hedging on the ability to produce fissile material for a nuclear deterrent. I would, keep your eyes on Poland, especially the last couple of weeks. They've been very active in saying they believe that they need their own deterrent. Japan and of course South Korea.
So I want to turn in a moment to you, Andrew, to build on what we just heard from Jacob, from MICHAELA. I'd like to sort of pivot the conversation coming off exactly what Jacob said to nuclear arms control and also proliferation risks, and get to the audience by the bottom of the hour here for questions and comments. So just on the sort of a quick broader framing on nuclear arms control, the critical context here is that the START Treaty, or I guess to be more precise, the New START Treaty, was allowed to expire in early February. And it was the last big piece of Cold War era of US, Russia, formerly Soviet, US arms control, going back half a century to the SALT agreements in the 1970s, right?
Yeah.
And Trump pulled the plug. Putin signaled a willingness to keep it informally, not legally binding, but informally in place for a year or so while something could be worked out, but that didn't happen. And already there is a decision by Trump for the US to increase, not decrease, nuclear stockpiles. The Putin and Russia are doing the same. China has been developing its nuclear capability rapidly now for many years, but particularly rapidly the last several years. Other countries, Jake just referred to, are now talking about nuclear deterrence. I mean, this is on the agenda now after the election of a very conservative, security conscious, committed prime minister now in Japan. So is the nuclear genie going to be out of the bottle? Here, I mean, are we watching the retreat, I mean, really the elimination of a half a century of binding, verifiable agreements? And if so, what are the implications for US national security, let alone global security? Andrew, to you first, and then back to MICHAELA, Jake.
Sure. So I'll save my note on the fact that we're also looking increasingly at private sector actors playing a role in war. We'll do that in Q&A if you're interested. On the nuclear piece, what you've heard from Jake is a focus on proliferation amongst erstwhile partners and allies of the United States. And so I want to take this in a couple of different directions. So there's that piece, very worried about it. I think if we're not thinking and looking at Poland, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Japan, we're kidding ourselves. Amongst great powers, China is quantitatively increasing and perhaps even more importantly, qualitatively broadening. So they're investing in ICBMs, very similarly to what the United States has. They're trying to get their next generation of submarines will be quieter, and have nuclear weapons at Hainan Island. Potentially, they will keep them on deployment rather than a bastion. That's a big change. And so they're no longer relying on real mobile ICBMs. They think, rightly or wrongly, the US intelligence assets can see them. And so they don't think they get survivability from their existing architecture. On the back of that reality, there were conversations during the Biden administration about the potential for a quantitative increase in the United States, because our members of Congress can do math sometimes. And they say, I want to be able to have as many as China plus Russia. I will say, like, as an academic analyst, that's a terrible way to think about what you need in the nuclear sphere. We don't match capabilities of adversaries. What we call offset capabilities of adversaries. But that is not popular amongst Congress, because all they can do is math. We'll kind of see how that piece. But yes, I expect the US to quantitatively increase, and we've just qualitatively broadened too. So we're deploying SLICM, so the submarine launched cruise missile with a nuclear warhead on top within the next 2 years. And so a lot's changing in the great power piece. The Russians, as we're saying, there's never been a nuclear weapon that they don't want. Jake, maybe you can talk about the cruise missile that they're developing, but they're talking about an autonomous nuclear torpedo, the Poseidon system, all of that. What often gets left out of these conversations, if you were to look at things like Iran and Venezuela, and before that Libya, those were all countries that couldn't manage to get a nuclear weapon, right? The lesson that despots are learning from those examples is that it may be better to have them than not. See North Korea. And so that's one of the things I worry about too. So it's kind of proliferation all around, right? Both vertically and horizontally. And the world of 2026 moving forward, like, I think look very different than the world in which we had a lot of clarity between two great powers. They're the ones negotiating. That's how we get arms control and get to some sort of deal.
Great. Thank you. So there's two things I'm going to touch on briefly. One of them is related to allied proliferation, as you spoke about initially, and then I'll talk a little bit about what sort of systems do we expect to see, especially from Russia and China going forward. So allied proliferators like Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, and Poland, again, not yet proliferators, but likely ones, are all very technologically advanced countries. For the last 30 years, we have been looking for proliferation taking place in countries like Iran, Libya, Iraq, countries that have relatively poorly developed academic and industrial bases. Going forward, we may well miss many of the technical signatures from these proliferators because there is more than one pathway to the bomb. The bomb is an 80-year-old technology. It is a technology for which there has been much R&D in terms of minimizing signatures development. And while the Iranians might not be able to pull off, say, suppressing the off-gassing of noble gases when they do fuel reprocessing, you can bet that the Poles or the South Koreans would be able to do such a thing. They may be able to break out very, very quickly once they have the basic elements in place, and do so in a way that catches us off guard if our technical intelligence is not sufficiently advanced. If you look at the academic literature from these countries, you can already see whisperings of this. You can see talk about off-gas management systems for molten salt reactors. Well, guess what? Those off-gas management systems will work just as well on a reprocessing facility. You can see evidence of work on centrifuge technologies, not gaseous diffusion, but vortex nozzle technologies, all sorts of things. And there is, this growing nuclear startup ecosystem that is primarily within the United States. But these technologies may well be developed by nuclear startups that exist outside of the United States. It might even be a way of doing some kind of initial defense work in a way that is deniable for development. Okay, so pivoting from that cheerful note to what sort of systems do we expect to see from Russia and China? Russia, for many years, has been concerned about the prospect of U.S. ballistic missile defense getting good enough to blunt their strategic deterrent. And up until very recently, I would have said that was just not really a miss. But the performance of ballistic missile defense systems in Ukraine and during the 12-day war that Israel had with Iran we see the beginnings of a capability that might in 20, 30, 40 years develop to the point where it could have an impact on the strategic balance. And the Russians have long thought this, and so they are investing in systems that are, quote, survivable against such defenses. And they've gone in really unusual and exotic directions. In March of 2018, Putin unveiled a total of 6 new systems. One of them is an air-launched ballistic missile that is kind of billed as a hypersonic missile. That's actually been used in a conventional form in Ukraine. There is Poseidon, which I heard alluded to earlier, which is a nuclear-powered submersible vehicle. So it is basically an autonomous nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarine. This might be used, as a weapons delivery system, or it might be kind of the harbinger of a new generation of ultra-heavy, very large USV that could be used for anti-submarine warfare, a variety of conventional roles as well. And then we have Borovesnik, which is kind of the craziest of the systems that has been developed, and that is a nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed cruise missile. The idea behind this being is that you have a loitering cruise missile with an effectively unlimited range. At the beginning of a conflict you expect to escalate, you can launch this thing. It can effectively circle in some location, waiting for an attack order. And as a result of its effectively indefinite range, it can take unusual trajectories to its target, which greatly widens the search area for your cruise missile defense systems. And cruise missile defenses, while as opposed to ballistic missile defenses, scale just with basically the linear distance that you have to protect over, so your coastline or your border, whatever it may be. China is also looking at exotic nuclear weapons delivery systems, though primarily in the realm of boost glide vehicles, so hypersonic boost glide vehicles. Okay, quick question for the audience. Who thinks a hypersonic vehicle is faster than a ballistic missile? Who thinks it's
You've got a lot of my students to be fair.
Okay, okay, good. I always, when I have the chance, I make sure to inculcate this in every audience. Hypersonic systems are not faster. You may simply have less of a warning before they impact as a result of the radar horizon effect. China is interested in these because they are potentially more survivable against ballistic missile defenses. At a much smaller scale, at the tactical level, we have the advent of relatively new defense systems that are based on directed energy. So the Israelis, for the very first time, used in combat a directed energy system called Iron Beam to shoot down relatively small rockets being launched from the Palestinian territories. While directed energy remains very, very nascent, in the next decades, you could see significant investment in this technology, mostly for short range, the defeat of short range and kind of theater range, ballistic missile or hypersonic systems.
So I want to bring MICHAELA back in, and I've got 2 questions for the panel before turning to the audience for your questions and comments. The first for MICHAELA is, just thinking about the apparent demise of START and nuclear arms control, and also considering the now risks of proliferation that appear to be greater than ever, or at least greater in the last year, months, than over the last previous few years. What are the implications for NATO and transatlantic security on the arms control side and the proliferation side? How can NATO, with or without U.S. leadership, adapt to this changing security environment?
I'm not sure that I'm exactly the right person for that question, but let me say something else that is related to the broader. I wanted to make a broader point here that takes us back to some of that, which is, I think, what all of you can ask yourselves is like, what's the point of NATO for the US? Right? The US is the most powerful country in NATO. Why would the US need NATO? So what is it that the US is getting from NATO in its analysis? And so the answer here is like, first of all, it's the NATO allies that helped the US in Afghanistan. Formally within NATO, it's like the UK that helped with the Iraq war, right? It's the willingness to participate in US military missions, giving them some kind of legitimacy. It is the access that US gains, right? And war theaters. This is a huge issue right now in the Iran war, where the US gets to use these military bases by its various allies. And if they would not grant that access, the tyranny of distance is serious, right? Like the US cannot project power at the same rate as it can at home. further away. And so this access to these bases is what provides US this capability in the world. It's also the intelligence access that the US gets, right? You have to put in place actual, physical installations to listen in. You have to be able to fly drones and land them and set up communication links from allied partners, right? So there's immense access benefits the US is getting from that. That is essentially what the force multiplier is about, right? Or one of the things it's about. And the final thing, and this brings us back, is that really NATO and any US defense alliance that it offers is a trade of security for autonomy. So the US provides security, and the member countries that are relying on US security provision in exchange are letting the US tell them what to do in a variety of foreign policy questions and security questions. So, and that includes like not having nuclear weapons, for instance. That includes, voting in alignment with US at the UN and the World Trade Organization. It means, supporting sanctions against Iran, in the 2010s that were uncomfortable for Europeans and costly for them, but they did it because they are part of this relationship with the US, where the US is providing security. The moment that the US's security provision is not serious anymore or cannot be relied on, why should the partners then give in any of their autonomy?
Yeah.
And that means on the nuclear side, why should they rely on the US and not make sure to build up their weapons and potentially establish their own nuclear systems? I mean, even Swedish newspaper has said that there should be a Nordic nuclear capability. So that's just as a general, and I think often maybe like Americans may wonder, what's the point of NATO? Why do we care if it survives? Is because you actually get a lot of benefits from NATO that I think are not always understood.
That's really helpful. So the question that I do want to put to all three of you, that I think will be of interest to everybody in the room before then turning to you for your questions and comments, is a question that we didn't contemplate when we started to prepare this panel subsequently last week. And that is, what have we seen and learned so far in the last 5 days since we woke up Saturday morning with the joint US-Israeli attack on Iran? What have we learned in terms of the conduct of warfare, the technology that's been deployed, the degree of coordination between US and Israel, the apparent lack of coordination with the European allies for political and diplomatic reasons for the most part, and how, what are we seeing that's new? And I have to just add, as a World War II aficionado, amazing to see a US submarine fire a torpedo and sink a so-called enemy ship for the first time since the end of World War II.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a lot in the last 5 days and nights here. And if you could each comment, or any two of you can comment on what are we seeing and learning that isn't just sort of interesting from a bang bang perspective, but more importantly has implications for the further conduct of warfare and for alliances and global security. What do we see?
So two things for me. I think one older inference and one newer inference. So the older inference is that the future of war is some amalgam of the First World War and Terminator. And the bits of it that are First World War and the bits of it are Terminator are very unclear. And certainly it's the case that, and this goes all the way back to thinking about Ukraine as well. The Ukraine war does not look the way that we expected. The wars in Gaza didn't look the way that we expected. Whatever it is that we're doing in Iran is unlikely to look the way that expected. And so that's kind of an older inference. The newer inferences, I think there's two worth discussing. The first is that, in MICHAELA and I's literature, there's a long literature of decapitation strikes and the degree under which the conditions under which it might be desirable or deemed entirely inappropriate. The adventurism to go and kidnap Maduro appears to have empowered the administration to think about that in Iran, and then what comes next. And I've heard conversations about Cuba over the weekend too. The difference between me and my students was that some of them were partying on Friday night. I was asleep and got woken up, right, to go on the radio. But they saw it on their text messages. The other piece of it is that the US is struggling. So we've got advertently or inadvertently enemies across the world, and we're not prepared to fight on multiple fronts at once. And even with what we're doing in Iran, we're moving military material and personnel into the Middle East. after moving forces into the Caribbean, which are arguably two of the places that if we were thinking about the war games that I was doing in the late 2010s, not places where we have proximate security interests, right? All of the work that we were doing were Baltic Sea scenario, South China Sea and Taiwan Strait scenario. That's what we cared about. And so one of the things that we got from our allies is the ability to be present in those theaters, even when US focus is elsewhere. But one of the things that really concerns me, particularly given the bad relationship we have with our allies, and I'm British, just about sounding like this. The relationship between London and Washington has never been at this low of an ebb. And they have joint basing arrangements. We fly stories out of Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia had various different CIA operations, some of those torture memos, if you remember back to that during 9/11, that was happening on UK military bases. And so the ability for the US to project power in multiple theaters at once is a really open question. And it goes back to a lot of what we talked about, the defense industrial base and what have you too.
Good. MICHAELA or Jake?
Yeah, so I'm actually more thinking about it, but it's like, I'm not sure that I have a lot of things that surprise me. It's more like I think about what it says about IR theory to some extent. So for instance, there's like in IR theory, this idea of diversionary war, right? If you experience domestic trouble, you will start international conflict. So that comes up in this context. There's also this idea of moral hazard or entrapment within alliances where your smaller partner behaves aggressively and drags you into a conflict. And that's some of the narrative like President Trump has now rejected, that Israel has dragged US in, but that's like sort of an interesting thing to think about in this context. I'm also I think it reestablishes the importance of access, right? Those spaces the US really needs. And actually Britain refused to have Diego Garcia used, and I forget this other base used initially, is now allowing it, but with strict, only for defensive purposes. Similar, that's what the French are doing. The Spaniards are saying no way. And in fact, even though it was announced, by like the press secretary that now they are cooperating, they said, no, we are not cooperating. And so I think you're seeing some of the dynamics where it becomes also politically costly for those leaders to like support the US, given that their populations are upset with Americans' foreign policy. So I would say I was, in a way, I'm not really sure to think about it, because I'm surprised that the allies actually have been this cooperative, because if you think about it, I mean, Britain and France have support, and Germany, and Chancellor Merz was just there and met President Trump, have been actually more supportive maybe than I expected, given this, but then also in some ways less supportive because of these like strict limitations on defensive use, and the Spaniards being completely on it, but not.
I mean, what we're really seeing is not just a greater fragmentation, but really fracturing of collective security, particularly with our transatlantic. Jake, do you want to add something quickly, and then we'll turn to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you haven't picked up from my comments so far, I really come at this from an engineering angle, and I'm very interested in kind of the details of the weapon systems involved. What I think we can say from this conflict so far is that our missile defense magazine depth is wholly insufficient, not only for this conflict, but for Europe. And very soon we will be in a position where we don't even have any interceptors to offer the Europeans. And they will have to go it on their own when it comes to the development of air defense systems. If they would like to, be able to blunt ballistic missile attack. And we have to understand what that means for our relationship with Europe going forward, if we simply do not even have the munitions that we would have sold when we won. And then the second point is something that I think has been hammered home by many speakers over the last few years, and that is we have not learned from Ukraine. We have not learned that the lesson that relatively cheap systems are able to extract a large toll if you have them in sufficient quantities. We just saw a THAAD radar. I don't know if this is fully confirmed, so please don't take this to the bank, but it looks like a THAAD radar may have been hit and significantly damaged by a one-way attack drone. That is a monumental loss of capital. That is $1 billion radar. It may have been taken out by something that costs about as much as a Toyota Camry. So we have to think about the implications of that.
Because you were quick, I just want to turn to Andrew on a topic that you flagged, and I'll want to add a minute comment to myself because I'm involved in it with an unusual angle, and that's the role of the private sector in cutting edge defense tech. And you're interested in that, you follow that. I'm sure Jake does, and probably MICHAELA as well. And I'd like to add a quick comment. Then let's do it quickly and then get to the audience. So what do you have in mind as an observation there?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, a lot of the back-end infrastructure for things like intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance that MICHAELA mentioned, one of the places that European countries may look to very quickly get capability is the private sector. And there's a lot of unpacking that needs to happen via the degree that Maxar, Planet, or Starlink are US companies and are going to follow the interests of the US government in these conflict contexts, or the degree to which they are a company that are selling wares, right, to anybody that comes in. Of course, we talked about this ad nauseum vis-a-vis Starlink and its applications in the Ukraine war, but there's other things too, right? Space assets used for situational awareness. Any of you can buy satellite imagery over any target that you would like, with very few limitations. And there's various different vendors that are effectively providing intelligence as a service to various different European militaries as well. And so the world in which we have Manhattan projects for very expensive, right, to Jake's point, military systems is perhaps over, right? A world in which we've got private sector actors, whether it's Anduril or what have you, right, providing relatively bespoke solutions to governments and militaries. That's the world that we're in. And of course, you know, obviously we work very closely with a lot of the deep tech companies in the Valley, and there are a slew of them and more money going to them all the time. But again, Israel's got a very, very well developed, right, private sector that's selling these wares. And actually there are some European countries as well that are kind of playing in that sandbox too.
So let me just add a quick comment from my corporate responsibility, human rights hat above and beyond US foreign policy over the years. And that is, I'm sure you all read about this extraordinary rupture between Pentagon and Anthropic, and all intertwined with both Pete Hegseth's predilections, but also the intense, nasty competition between Anthropic and OpenAI.
Yeah.
But Anthropic apparently refused to not refuse the Pentagon's demands that it drop certain ethical guardrails that were not very clearly delineated, but at least in certain ways, the way that AI would be deployed in highly complex military operations. So that is sort of the latest development in what is a rapidly evolving debate here. And it's against the backdrop of rapid development of these technologies and also huge investor interest, particularly in Europe, in the context of European rearmament pushed by Trump for the 5%, and now the lessons learned from Ukraine and now the last 5 days of what the Europeans have to do. And it's a particular interest to me because I'm one of about 15 people, but probably among the core 3 or 4, driving an initiative with American, especially British and European colleagues, to develop principles for responsible investment in defense, the defense technology, and I'm sort of drawing on my own background, Calvert Investments, but we have announced our initiative publicly. It's going to be called Guidance for Responsible Investment in Defense. GRID is the acronym. It's a little clumsy, but it works for now. And we'll have something in the public domain in the fall. But my point is that there's a real demand now from investors who are determined to get in on the party here with these valuations increasing of particularly European defense companies, yet at the same time are aware of the ethical dilemmas and some of the stakeholder pressures and concerns from their own investors. So it's a whole other ripple that's emanating out that I thought would be of interest from a sort of corporate responsibility and human rights perspective. So watch this space. So with that, let's go to all of you, and I really want to encourage not only questions but comments. The gentleman right here from the center first.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to all of you. I've been honored to Master Book so far in this. I'm happy I got to interact outside of class. But my question's a bit more on the technical side, so I think Dr. Head was probably best and less ready as well. So it's about directed energy. So on the Israeli front, obviously Arrow 3 and David Slim, the interceptors cost in the millions of dollars. Iron Dome, each interceptor is $100,000, but with the Iron Beam, it's a few dollars in interception. So I was curious, do you think, especially given the asymmetry and the costs that we're seeing now with like a drone taking out a THAAD system, things of that nature, that research interest in these systems is going to continue to exponentially increase over the coming years? And obviously there's been a lot of talk about Golden Dome as this kind of like lofty new Star Wars kind of thing in Trump's imagination, but maybe not in the kind of broad continental defense, but in more point defense, especially in these theaters, kind of directed energy system becoming the new default that countries look to maximize the kind of cost effectiveness.
I'll split that into two questions. The first question is, will investment continue to increase at a rapid rate? Absolutely. Yeah, I believe that, especially for point defenses, these are incredibly useful systems, especially against things like one-way attack UAVs. They are not effective at very long ranges at the moment. And I don't know what the technical pathway looks like to increasing the range to, you know, tens of miles, hundreds of miles. That's a very sketchy direction. I believe that investment will increase rapidly just because we need more point defenses in a wide variety of contexts. The second part of that question, which is, do you see them as being the default? No, they are not scalable at the moment to the ranges and the types of projectiles that we need to intercept in many circumstances. Very useful for point defenses.
Thanks. Others, gentlemen in the far back here, and then we'll go to.
So, thank you, by the way. I know the main focus of this is Europe and how we're going to provide for European defense in our common defense framework, but given the amount of Tomahawks that we have invested into Iran, and also the amount of SM-6s that we've wasted defending Israel in the previous wars, I actually don't know this because I'm not sure if the numbers are available in the public domain. Has standard SM-6 missile production increased since the invasion of Ukraine? Is it still at like a very boutique 21 a year? And do we have any chance at all of deterring a concerted Chinese ballistic missile attack on all of our assets in the Pacific?
Can we say that one? Or, yeah. Yeah. So the public numbers aren't available. There have been increases, but they're not nearly what we need them to be on the expended side. But that's not just that weapon system, it's more or less across the board. What some will tell you is that it might not matter because you don't necessarily, there's multiple weapon systems that perform the same mission function, right? So there's ultimately with China, you're hoping to deter them from attacking, right? Our naval vessels in the region with all sorts of other things, not necessarily, right, being able to shoot things out of the sky. But it's like we both said, it's a big problem, right? Our div is a bit of a mess. And it is the case that people in Valley are really excited about defense tech. They probably won't be when they realize returns are linear, not geometric. But that's not, we need both ultimately, right? You need the primes and the kind of the legacy systems, and then you also need all of that, all those new types of assets too. In terms of like the broader, and this goes back to your question as well. We're getting, for the first time, we're increasingly focused on getting the cost of fitness exchange ratios moving in our favor, right? Not moving in the favor of the adversary. And Jason, that the problem and the drag on that is bureaucratic politics. And if you're interested, you read Mike Horowitz's work. It's a really good job of getting into this. But if you're a general or an admiral, you have generally been, right, like let's take the Air Force, for example, right? You have been an F-16 pilot in all likelihood, so you get to the senior levels of the Air Force. If you're at senior level in the Navy, you are very likely somebody who has commanded a carrier group, commanded an aircraft carrier, and was a naval aviator, Tom Cruise, right? So that's the way that they've all gone through. Therefore, they have a lot of stock invested in very capital intensive programs, and they're not that interested in hearing all of us talk about attritables and that being the future of war. And so there's three models for the future of the future of the US fighting force. It's do what we've always done, large expensive systems, right? Aircraft carriers and what have you. There's the opposite, which is what Mike Brown wants, right? Like attritables make Taiwan a porcupine, right? Drone swarms and what have you, UUVs, USVs. Or there's like something in the middle. Something in the middle is actually what we're probably doing, right? So we've now got very big platforms with like drones that come off of them, right? So think with CCAs or Mandrill, for example. But it's hard to get all of that, right? To kind of, I don't know how much it actually is going to drive our cost of force exchange down, but just to say like there's a big bureaucratic piece of this that a lot of people aren't paying attention to.
Well, that's me. Let's serve you in the back there.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about kill switches, which is, I've never heard of before. Is this a theoretical concern, or is this something that has actually been announced and is, has been implemented and might have been implemented across the board for an ally who turns into an enemy, or what can you say about kill switches?
I was the one who raised it, but I'm the one with the least technical knowledge on this panel. I mean, I just remember reading about it, so that is a concern of allies, that they worry that they buy American fighter jets that need to be serviced also continuously. And operating systems need to be constantly active, and that could be dismantled if the US didn't want them to do what they're doing. And so that's a vulnerability that they don't want to risk anymore. So I'm not sure, so my reading is more in the news about this is a concern of allies when they are thinking about what to buy. So in terms of technically what is happening there, I don't know if my co-panelists have more to say about this, but that.
Okay, sure. So we should kind of make a distinction here between a active kill switch, someone pressing a button in DC, and passive kill switch, which is simply not supported. I have no idea whether or not there is an active kill switch of any sort. That sort of information is not something that would have been disclosed publicly. I think it is unlikely that such a capability would exist. That's not a fun thing for your ally to find when they're digging through something. Passive kill switch is something that has always existed in any weapon system that is made and maintained by a foreign entity. By not supplying parts, by not supplying new low observable coating, which wears and rusts and comes apart. By not supplying technicians, you can passively degrade the ability of an ally that's become an adversary to maintain those systems. Now, that said, allies that have become adversaries can get very crafty. Take a look at Iran and F-14s, right? The last time that the US was maintaining F-14 sold to Iran was 1979, and they still have two of them flying, maybe. But as of basically, could Europe potentially replace the role of the US defense contractors in maintaining these systems? I think the answer is yes, but at much cost and much time.
Yeah. Others, yes, sir.
And I just bring up probably the most boring aspect of all of this, which is procurement. And I'm thinking here that in Ukraine, here they are beavering away in people's garages and basements, producing all these drones. And especially when those drones are functionally obsolete after 6 months. I mean, you couldn't negotiate a contract with the Pentagon in under 6 years, maybe, to have it signed, sealed, and delivered. Is procurement up to the new weapons, the new reality of war, and maybe therefore the indigenization of Europe actually is a lot more realistic because they're relying upon the Northrop Grumman's. I mean, they are slow moving beasts, and maybe Europe can be a little bit more agile.
Yeah, so proving that wrong clocks are right twice a day. Pete Hegseth and agree on the acquisitions process being broken here in the US. So, and to the extent to which that actually here in the Valley, we've got a defense innovation unit who don't use the normal FAR contracting vehicle, so the federal acquisition requirements for procuring services and also goods from startups. So they use something called other transaction authorities or OTAs that were first developed by NASA for the space mission. And those are getting, those are actually relatively successful at getting new technology to the warfighter on time horizons of 9 to 18 months, which is extraordinarily fast. Things are going through the primes, like we did a lot of work on ICBMs in my lab, right? we've been doing nuclear modernization for 2 years. We are 2 years behind, and we're hoping that 2035 is like the date. And so, ultimately, different types of systems require different contracting vehicles. But I think everybody agrees that it's broken. We've got effectively McNamara. We actually do. Is McNamara's procurement requirements. I'll just say, like, I've got a bit of a hobby horse here. We have really convoluted procurement requirements because we're trying to drive down all the things that Elon was worried about at Doge, right? We want to avoid fraud, waste, and abuse. But if you go back and look at Eisenhower, he got USS Nautilus, right? Submarine. He got submarine launched ballistic missiles. He got Corona satellites, right? All brand new tech of the time, some of which we didn't think was technically possible. He got it within 2.5 years by giving millions of dollars to his buddies from when he was in the army. Lots of fraud, lots of waste, lots of abuse. You got all this innovation. And so, there is this kind of trade-off to be had there between risk and reward that I don't think we talked about.
But to Eisenhower's credit, he warranted his farewell address in the so-called
That's
military
true,
industrial complex, so give him that.
Although he's to blame for it, but yeah.
So others, comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I was reading a report this morning about Iranian RF interference over their territory and how it disrupted 3 U.S. communication satellites in GEO. Yeah. There are other cases as well with the AWS centers in Bahrain. So there are these systems that aren't necessarily completely national security, but they're more critical to national resilience for us. And what are the implications of global turmoil on these systems that aren't purely defense?
You want to take that one? I can. Do you want to go first? I can take one. You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. That's why we teach space and national security policies here at Berkeley. I mean, ultimately, right, all of those assets are terribly vulnerable, and the US relies on them a great deal for both military and civilian functions. And if you're an adversary, they're an incredibly juicy target because they are so vulnerable, and because asymmetrically the US relies on them compared to the wide variety of adversaries that you face. That's true, by the way, not only of Iran, but China or Russia too. They don't rely on spaces nearly as much as we do. So yeah, I think it's and also to the jamming technology. That's something that also got better during Ukraine. It's not just drone warfare got better. All the jamming technologies got better as well. And so you've got funny stories of people matching on dating apps 3,000 miles away from where they are by virtue of GPS spoofing that's going on. And so we'll see that. That is a piece of modern warfare. That's the Terminator part of modern warfare, not the First World War part.
Just to add on to that, a lot of the companies that are operating many of these assets are extremely naive about the geopolitical risks to their assets. And it can be very difficult to get across to them that they are a target. They don't want to believe this because that necessitates expensive mitigations on their end. And so, yes, you can expect to see these systems targeted simply because they're easy to target and they do have a massive impact.
But there is a theory, there's two different theories of interest. So one is spend all the money to do radiation hardening and what have you, which is incredibly expensive, or you just do defense in depth. And you just say, I'm going to deploy, right, instead of one system, I'm going to deploy 10, 20, right? So proliferated LEO is a part of that story. So proliferation of satellite assets in low Earth orbit for communications functions, intelligence functions, and all the rest.
Others, comments, questions? Yes.
I have a question about for the concern of other countries developing nuclear weapons. Is there any strategy that can be employed for looking upstream, like the US getting involved in the Congo and trying to have a foot in Congo where there's a lot of uranium coming out? Is there any reasonable strategy with like surveillance increasing and all that to start to look at that as a way of constraining other countries from nuclear weapons?
So I wish. Unfortunately, uranium is extremely abundant in the Earth's crust. And the reason that places like the Congo are useful for the nuclear fuel cycle is not because that is the only place to get uranium. That is the cheapest place to get uranium. They have particularly easy to mine geology and frankly non-existent worker protections. You can get uranium just about wherever you look. There are very few parts of the Earth's crust where it is difficult to find. India is one example where they have like very, very poor uranium resources, but most countries have access to something somewhere, whether it's as the result of phosphate mining, as a result of rare earth mining. The nuclear supply chain, just because the physical quantities of material are so small, is relatively hard to choke off upstream of the point at which enrichment happens. We can look, however, upstream at certain technologies that are necessary for, say, enrichment or reprocessing, certain materials, and certain techniques. Looking at the academic literature, looking at the industrial processes that are being developed, can give you some hints as to whether or not proliferation is either being hedged or is ongoing.
And both the intelligence agencies look at that, and the IAEA actually openly does that and also discloses that as well.
Good. Other comments, questions? Yes, hi.
To combine like something that I'm checking also that the Professor Montes said like the US Washington, no sorry, the US and London relations being so low, and then also the like accountability domestically for Europeans. Do you see further European involvement? Because in fact I grew up about 40 minutes away from where Andrew's from, and I mean I think the common word that you see on like British social media at the moment is lapdog. Yeah. No one wants to continue being the US's lapdog. So do you think that like taking this into account accountability, like European involvement will increase?
Yeah, and I think the Europeans have to hedge right now, right? So, I mean, we just established that they will need years to have that capability to really defend themselves. And so what they need to do is basically stay on Washington good side, like as much as they can, while building their capability. And I feel like that's what it really explains current positioning. Meanwhile, they also have to deal with domestic pressures to not be the lapdog. Which are, not insignificant. I mean, this is like one of the things I think President Trump already in his first term of office, and this one, he underestimates or doesn't see that the other side also has a domestic constituency, and that they are, they get offended and they hold their leaders that they feel are giving too much. We're seeing this in India, actually, right, where there's very significant criticism of Prime Minister Modi about this trade deal, but all over the world, and also it becomes trickier and trickier because if the US cannot be relied on to defend these countries anymore, and they provide their bases as access points for the US, they then become legitimate targets, for like in Iran, for instance, the base in Cyprus, as we've seen. And so then how do you defend that continued support to your domestic public that you're not getting much in return, but you're also risking things. And so I feel like it's a cycle where the Europeans have to currently, I think, just walk this very fine line with, they need a couple of years, but I think their sights is set on, they understand the US is not reliable.
Yeah, I would just add from my perspective, as somebody who spends about a third of my time in the UK, Chatham House, and next week in Oxford, that I see a degradation of the British willingness to follow Trump through every twist and turn. And, there's never a final denouement, but Trump's press conference disparaging Prime Minister Starmer, however long Prime Minister Starmer will be at number 10, could be days or weeks or months, we'll see. But that did not land well. And it's been notable to see that the Tories have really reduced their rhetorical support for Trump, and even Farage was put in his place by Trump. So I see, with not enough British to be there all the time, that the ties are weakening. And I would just add, and it's mostly an unserious observation, but not totally, that we always used to say the Queen is not amused. I can tell you that I'm sure that the King is not amused that he's being dragooned into state visit here after having already accepted a second state visit from Trump. Britain wanted to get something out of this, and instead they're getting their prime minister disparaged and 15% tariffs. It's not a good deal for them.
Just the one thing I'd say, Mark Carney of Davos gave all the middle powers vocabulary to engage in that hedging behavior.
Exactly.
I mean, we're I think, actively gonna be revisiting all of the literature on hedging.
Oh,
And to be fair, it's been happening for a while, right? Singapore, South Korea, we've already mentioned.
Yeah.
Some countries are relatively expert at it, and Britain's gonna have to learn those lessons
That's right.
really quick.
And Carney's just on his way back, or maybe he's arrived back from a trip to New Delhi, and to Canberra. Where he is rebuilding a relationship with India after the assassination of Sikhs in Canadian territory traced to Indian intelligence, but also now in Australia. If there can't be two more kindred spirits, like-minded countries in the world, not just because they're British Commonwealth, than Canada and Australia. There we go, little powers.
I just was gonna briefly comment, so I think most of the development will be towards Europeans trying to, self-sustainable on their own. But there's also the China factor in this. I don't think we have brought up China at all at this panel. And sort of, what does this mean? I think Europeans don't necessarily feel pushed towards China in a clear way. It's not like they will flee the US and like China will become their partner. I think they view themselves as having to de-risk both of those sides. But we are seeing, all these leaders, showing up in China in the last couple of months. And it's interesting because it's not like, and relationships are strengthening. It's not like China is giving anything to these countries, right? It's not making any concessions on anything. In fact, treated them really harshly under the whole rare earth minerals bans. And it's really only China can stand there and say, look, we are though upholding the international order. And so it's like really handing a victory here to China and all of this.
Yeah, to China and to Russia, both, however alarmed they may have been by the events of last Saturday, it says they're probably more titillated than alarmed, because it gives them license to do what they've been doing or threatening Putin, obviously, in Ukraine and potentially Xi with Taiwan. I mean, the point of this whole discussion is that the world has become an even more unstable, unpredictable, less secure place, not just in the last 5 days, but in the last 13 months. And not that it was nirvana before Trump 2 started on January 20, 2025, but there has been a clear slide towards greater instability and insecurity. I mean, that's kind of the headline, right? Yep. So we have a couple of minutes for like a minute, just for another quick question or comment from anybody who wants to or challenge us. Yes, sir.
With our allies developing the technology to create nuclear weapons without our knowledge and the weakening of our nuclear treaties, how will this affect our international relations moving forward with the UN, WTO, US bases abroad?
That's the focus of the fourth and final session in this series on the 29th of April, but any place to practical.
Are we still funding any international organization?
60.
Exactly. But I mean, their relationships down.
Yeah. Thank you to the panelists.